ask Homie and Wimblendra to come up at this time and for us to also reconnect our co-stars. And let me migrate to my proper part of the stage. I was so excited I just went and sat over there. But please come up. And I would like to open up the floor to Q&A comments from you. We have about 20 to 25 minutes. And as usual, we have mics coming around the room. Please tell us your name and your institution. We'd like to hear from as many of you as we can. So please don't be shy to raise your hands. I'll come back to the panel for quick reflections, and we go from there. John, wonderful that you're starting us off. It's a tradition at IFPRI, so John.
Thank you. Is it on? Yes. No, it's not. Hello?
I can't turn it on.
Thinks it's on, but it's not.
Okay, let's be efficient and pass this to John.
Great, thank you. I'm John Coon with the Hunger Project. I just wanted to ask really anyone on the panel to address this challenge that Congressman McGovern posed, because this report, while important for pointing out the driver of conflict, can also, in how we talk about it, add fuel to the narrative that, oh, aid doesn't work and it's all hopeless, so why bother? So it's going to be absolutely crucial for us to have a shared narrative that says, look, development works when you do it. You know, building food security initiatives actually works, and the report highlights that. And conflict is causing hunger in our world, more hunger, and it's going to get worse. So somehow we need a pithy, powerful way to characterize this report that way, because that, for me, is the number one takeaway. And some of the reporting I've seen in the press are starting to pull people's attention to, oh, we're failing, it's hopeless, don't bother.
John, that was an uncharacteristically depressing comment of yours.
I was hoping for a call to action.
But I'm waiting for you to put forward a call to action. But while you think about that, let's pass the mic next to Faustine. And Faustine, she's coming along. And introduce yourself, and hopefully let's... No, here, right next to you, Faustine.
Yes. Thank you. I'm Faustine Wabiri with Bread for the World. I'm particularly intrigued with the point about bridging the humanitarian development divide. I'm really glad that that's beginning to be more focused on. However, I'm not clear on some of the ways we could do this, given that humanitarian actors, for example, are guided by humanitarian principles, one of which is to go in and support communities and not engage in any kind of politics. Well, we know that most of these conflicts are politically driven. So how do we actually bridge that gap in a way that, or are we talking about an overhaul of the system perhaps? Because some of the fundamentals of humanitarian and development don't agree.
Thank you, Faustine. If there's any one or two more comments, I'll take them at this time. Otherwise, I'll go back. And yes, there's a hand right at the middle of the room.
Hi, Nancy Morgan, ex-economist from FAO. In fact, my question is more for Kostas and perhaps for Robin in terms of when you look at the indicators, there's been a downward trend in the indicators, but I noticed for 2009, when you had the food crisis, there was no uptick. I remember a discussion on methodologies and changing methodologies, but I'm surprised because when you don't show that in a major food crisis, even though it was only for a year and a half, it implies no price transmission to countries, developing countries. And when you look at ERS, the Economic Research Service just came out with some food security in the U.S., and I'm glad that Representative McGovern mentioned this, because 43 million Americans are at risk in terms of food security, or food insecurity, and when they did their analysis, you had an impact of the high food prices in 2008, which was compounded by the financial crisis in 2009. So I guess my question is how these numbers, to have one uptick in a consistent decline was sort of surprising. And I think I'm glad that McGovern was here because they're supposed to have a the budget reconciliation in the House and looking at food stamp discussions and balancing the budget through the elimination of poverty programs, it isn't very optimistic for the U.S. And it's like, how can we do something as development practitioners globally when in the U.S. we can't even do anything?
Nancy, thank you so much. Let me then come back to the panel, but let me begin with Jerome. If Kostas and his team wish to make any responses at this time, or whether you'd like me to come to you last. I don't think we can hear you. Would you unmute?
We are here. Just to know the mic, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. The first question has to do with the development and humanitarian, how to do it. I think the report does have the examples where, for example, in Uganda, on how humanitarian and development were hand in hand, trying to solve some of the key problems in Uganda. So if this happens, it can happen. The second point that we have to recognize is that in different types of crises, the instruments have to be balanced differently. For instance, we have three principles in the document. One, the ongoing conflicts, the greater stability contexts, and then in countries where there are peace accords. And so the balance of programs and funding between humanitarian and development should be different in these kinds of situations. I take from the panelists the fact that a large amount of aid in conflict situation comes in terms of humanitarian response. We consider this, of course, essential. It's not a matter of declining, but there are two parts to it. One is to recognize that the development support is being grossly underestimated and underfunded. And the second, that especially for agricultural rural development, that are key sectors for building the resilience of populations in situations of conflict, have been further marginalized. So these are, there is no one size fits all, but it can, with better coordination of the agencies, it can be resolved. The last point I would like to make on this is that donor funding oftentimes for humanitarian and development come from different pockets. And those pockets are not always coordinating or talking to each other the way they should. So there is a problem, an institutional problem right there. So it's both on the side of donors and on the side of recipients. The second issue that was raised has to do with the impact of prices. We and FAO overestimated the effects of the price explosion, let's say, in the first years of in the period 2007-2009, by talking about a billion hungry people, which then of course will revise downwards. Why prices cannot first of all, we have to look at the nature of the data that we report, the prevalence of undernutrition. These are national data. And so the price increases in every particular country have to do with the net producers and net consumers of food, of course. The second is, I think it was mentioned, the transmission from the raw prices to the domestic prices. The third, in our estimates, we measure the prevalence of insufficient energy. The prevalence of undernourishment is about energy. And our work has shown that households that face higher prices, they cut down on the nutritional value of the food, and the quality rather than the calories that households get. So there are some explanations for why one wouldn't expect to find the types of mechanisms that that households use as coping strategies to deal with prices. The last point I would like to make is that the POU data do not always reflect the current situation because updated food balances come with a lag. And so we have to use ways of making projections. This is a chronic hunger measure. We used the food insecurity experience scale for the first time in this state of food insecurity report because the data are much more current and can capture situations of stresses in a particular year that can affect the food security situation. So that's why we published both the POU and the PS data in this office. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kostas. Let me come back to the room. I would like for our panelists to ask you to be brief, because I would like to do one quick round if we can again. May I begin with you, Homi? Would you like to come in on any remarks on this? And there should be a mic coming your way. Just switch it on, please.
Press the button.
Thank you. Let me start with the humanitarian development divide issue, and it's still surprising to me to see how little humanitarian assistance takes the form of cash. And every time that we do humanitarian assistance not using cash, we basically introduce distortions into markets and we undermine development. So, I don't know, we might be something a bit shy of even 25% in cash. It's very surprising to me how difficult it has been to make this kind of leap forward. But I think we know that this is a fairly easy win. It doesn't involve these very complicated institutional coordination issues about different people and different things. It's just simple common sense. So I really hope that we can put a lot of emphasis on movements towards greater use of cash transfers, where it's appropriate, of course, and that hopefully will take care of some of the bigger problems that we observe. On the issue of the how to make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think we just need better data and more disaggregated data. And I think that part of our problem is that the more we present data at these very aggregated, big bucket, essentially national statistics, it's difficult to identify where real progress is being made. And, and so we get a little bit lost. It's just a too high a level for people to relate. But increasingly, we have the ability to tell stories at a much more granular level. And whether that data comes from satellites, to some extent from big data, to some extent even from things like DHS's, I think the more we can use those kinds of stories, the more we'll be able to get over that problem. And just to give you one story, we've got a project at Brookings, and we tried to tell a good news story, which was on Côte d'Ivoire. And FAO had put out numbers on productivity in Côte d'Ivoire rising quite rapidly up to 3 tons per hectare. This year they revised the figures. They're back down to 2 tons per hectare. So, in basically in a 2-year period, I'm talking about historical data, so the same data has just been revised. Fine, that happens with data, But if we are literally unable to distinguish between cereal productivity levels of 2 tons per hectare and 3 tons per hectare in a country, we're in deep trouble with this stuff. So I think we have to invest much more in data and in disaggregated data to be able to tell these stories effectively.
Omi, thank you. And of course, data is music here. Rob, any short comments from your side?
Just very quickly, not to repeat what others have said, but the first one request was from John, I think, was to ask for a shared narrative. So the simple answer to that is, well, we do have a shared narrative, which I think is the 2030 agenda, which brings these elements together. The challenge is how that translates in concrete terms in any particular context. I think that's where partly some of Homi's comments come in and saying, well, if we don't make good assessments, not just about data, but proper assessments on the ground, how we do that. And that's also where institutions have to come together. Like for the identification where we have food crisis and famine situations, there's a joint interagency framework that establishes that. But when it comes to the action, then it's basically every agency on their own that make their assessment, okay, that's coming quickly and so on. So I think that needs to be followed by on-the-ground assessment. Now, what are the real problems? What would be courses of actions? And from response we have for early warning systems developed by various agencies, bring it together, not just looking at, okay, what would be the immediate response, but what should and can be done on the ground to also looking at the longer term. And subsequently, finally, what needs to change, particularly in the donor community, is to think more long-term, multi-annual. What you typically see if you look at the aid statistics is that particularly where there's conflict situations and then the conflict ends, then there's an enormous peak in the aid delivery in 1 or 2 years from the end of the conflict, and then it stops. And that's precisely the time you need to rebuild institutions and to get things going on the ground. So aid only becomes effective after that. So it should be phased better and come with a longer whole.
Thank you very much. Shall I come back to the room, and then I would like to give each panelist a chance to make their kind of key messages. Is that appropriate? If any final sort of comments from anybody in the room, any questions, comments, this is the moment. And I see 2 hands up here. One is with Shiva. Is there a mic coming?
Thank you very much. I'm Joan Galloso, formerly from USAID. State Department spent quite a lot of years negotiating in the FAO for the US. I just have a perspective. These questions are not new, and I think we have to start asking ourselves, why do we still have the same questions about the link between humanitarian and development assistance, about the low priority given to agricultural policy and resources in developing countries, about why donors are not. I don't know the answers, but I come to these meetings and I get gradually to be among the very oldest people in the room, and I look around and I see all these young people who are very much like my students at GW. I feel like it's important to say we're not looking at these problems for the first time, and we need to start asking ourselves, why is it that we still haven't? I think Costas gave us a few answers a minute ago, but I just felt like I had to say it.
Thank you very much. I feel like it's reading the March of Folly over and over. But I believe there was a hand at the very back.
Thanks for IFPRI and FAO for this event. My name is Walter. I work in Bangladesh with one NGO implementing a USAID government program. One of the things that I just want to make a comment on, I think it was mentioned very briefly, is the whole resilience conversation and how much I would have wanted to see a bit more of that in this conversation. And it may not necessarily be the answer to the interconnection between humanitarian and development, but I think there is something that we may want to be thinking about. We talk about the crisis has become our daily routine. and yet there's not enough investment to how those specific crises will be dealt with, because that's what people and farmers are dealing with every single morning when they wake up. How much will I plant? How much will I harvest? We're not having that particular conversation. So, I mean, obviously, it may be in the details of the report. I don't want to fault the report, but I think there's a greater focus. And even speaking to governments, where I work, there's always this big divide between the two actors. So again, probably just a pitch for resilience here as a bigger role in terms of addressing these food insecurity challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there are hands over there. I think, John, go ahead.
Some people online had questions. Dr. Lisa Kitanoja from the Post-Harvest Education Foundation asks, where does reducing food losses fit into this discussion? Asjad Sheikh of IFPRI's Islamabad office asks, are there any suggestions at the policy side to make agriculture nutrition sensitive? And finally, Claudia Ringler of IFPRI asks, the picture of future world food security is gloomy, but we have not heard much about what to do about it. Homie spoke about increased accountability of donors and recipient countries, and Congressman McGovern about telling better stories. What else should we be doing?
Okay. And I think there was a hand right next to you. Very quickly, please.
Hello, my name is Patricia. Good morning. My name is Patricia Biermeyer, and I am a professor at Georgetown University. My question is very simple. And since most of the people at the panel mentioned the governments, I want to know the role of the World Food Committee here, because the World Food Committee, CFS, is the only UN body that has representation by the government, civil society, and private sector. What is the responsibility and why a body like this, which is meeting next week also at FAO, has a responsibility to follow and to give probably recommendations or reach out to the countries with a report.
Thank you very much. Panelists, we have an incredible challenge in front of us. So I'm going to ask you to be concise. Pick what you can pick. Please don't answer everything. There's a chance to mingle with our audience here afterwards. Please be disciplined, and please also use this moment to give your key takeaway message. Vimlendra?
Thank you.
Is the mic on?
It's on. Yeah, okay. Thank you. I will yield to headquarters for answers on all technical issues and points raised. My only two key messages, if you ask me for, is that it's time has come for us to recognize that saving lives is important, but saving livelihoods to save lives is equally important. So it's extremely important, even in the context of emergencies and conflicts, to keep concentrating on, as Rob said, resilience building of rural households to ensure that livelihoods are saved, which in turn will automatically contribute to saving lives in the long run. My second point is around what Congressman McGovern said about political will. I just want to relate a story. Addressing the World Food Congress in 1963, John F. Kennedy had said that we have the technology, we have the finances to end hunger in our lifetime. All we need is will. Now that was 1963, today is 2017. We are still talking about political will. So the queue is there. I think it's necessary for world over national governments and all other stakeholders to pick up their cue and start working together. And as I said in my initial remarks, the figures are sobering, and it is a call to redouble our efforts. So we have to come together to ensure that the uptick which we see is just a blip and not a trend. And come the next report or the next, we do see a downward trend coming in again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Homi, very brief remarks.
Let me try to focus on what to do. I think that we have had some good success with research, but there's very little research capabilities really within individual countries. When you look at data sources like ASTI about how many experienced agricultural scientists and agronomists there are in countries that can help with dissemination, I mean, they are just dispiritingly low. Sometimes 1 per country, 2 people per country, that kind of thing. I think insurance, it goes a little bit into the resilience question, is now a very live possibility in terms of really being able to offer micro-insurance to farmers using new digital technologies which have cut down on transaction costs. I think technology more broadly is offering enormous possibilities. And finally, I would say we need to make some noise. People talk about political will. Well, politicians also follow where the pressures are. There are no pressures in these areas. If we can make more noise, we can get more action.
Thank you. Lucy?
I'll also try to focus on solutions. I think it was interesting one of the slides that Homi showed was about, he said countries that invest in food and nutrition security have better outcomes. And one of the countries on that chart was Peru. Peru has shown that rapid decreases in hunger and in stunting, in childhood stunting, which is such a tricky thing to move for countries. I mean, they have shown that progress is possible. Why? They invested money and they had strong political leadership at the very top, which leads me to the second point. Tied a little bit to John's first question in terms of, well, how do we change the narrative that there's all these conflicts and this migration and all this stuff and aid doesn't work? Well, it's unrealistic to put the burden of solving all of these problems on development assistance. We need diplomacy as well. There is another D. We need diplomacy, and right now in this country, our diplomacy apparatus is being gutted, and we need to, as American citizens, as voters, hold our elected officials accountable for stronger diplomatic leadership in resolving conflicts, in preventing conflicts that lead to food insecurity and malnutrition.
Rob, next to you, and just a heads up to Kostas, I will come to you last for your words. Not yet. Rob?
Okay, well, very briefly, let me first not to have this panel end on a too pessimistic note. I think we should recognize there's been a lot of improvement and success in reducing malnutrition and hunger around the world. And also nutrition among children and so on have improved, not just because of improvements in access to food, but also because of better health conditions, breastfeeding, and so on. So to recognize it. And so building on successes, I think, could be the way forward, where things is a good example. I think we can look at how that works out moving forward. Coming back to the conflict issue, is the peace accords in Colombia that were recently signed were reached partly on the promise of using transformation of rural areas and agriculture as a basis to rebuild livelihoods that have been affected by the 50-year conflict. And it's a good example of where you bring together sort of a long-term development, not just to put an end to the conflict, because that comes with the accords, but to lay the seeds to prevent any resurgence of the conflict moving forward. So I think we should build on those kinds of examples, but recognizing that moving forward things will be more difficult than they were in the past because of the complexity of the issues.
Thank you. Ansel? Pass the mic to him.
Thank you very much. I will just make two brief comments. One speaks to the fact that globally you've spoken about conflicts and the impact of conflicts on the nutrition and on the nourishment, which are well recognized and fairly pernicious problems. But let's not forget the situation in the region of the Americas, where in fact Haiti has been under humanitarian challenge for many years since the major earthquakes of 2010. And it's had tremendous impact in shortening life expectancies, and it's a crisis within our region, so let's not lose sight of that. And I say this particularly in the context of the natural disasters that have occurred to the Caribbean region recently. So while we're seeing the big issues of conflicts globally, let's not forget that natural disasters have a similar impact within the region of the Americas. Secondly, I'm going to speak again about double burden and the challenge of overnutrition, issues linked to obesity and overweight. And I will implore us not to forget this problem also. This is a problem of our doing, and the solutions can only be found by our policies. And I will implore you to recognize that for the first time in mankind's history, mankind has been around for 200,000 years. Our children will be sicker than we are and live shorter lives than we do unless we put the regulatory frameworks in place to protect them.
Thank you very much. Let me now come to Kostas in Rome for his final words.
Yes, thank you, Rajul. I think I will come back to the issue raised by Rob of complexity, and so which addresses the issue of data and information. The conflicts and the specific factors and vulnerabilities are very context specific. So one of the first things that one needs to do is to understand the direct and indirect channels and impacts. The second is that there's no, the multi-sectoral causal analysis, and we point this out in the report, an intervention that address both chronic and acute food insecurity and malnutrition are necessary. The third, as we said before, that there is more to be done on policies and programs and investments for agricultural development as a key sector for building resilience and where actually conflicts often happen. So it's a matter of both prevention, but also within conflict situations. We have to give support to the displaced populations because we have to realize that more than half the refugees and internally displaced people originate in conflict countries and remain there. So that's an important part of the exercise. A very important point that's raised in the report is that we should understand and support the household coping strategies in situations of conflict. Supporting mechanisms like social protection, etc., should be geared to support the strategies of households. And finally, we should have interventions that are sensitive to the needs of men, women, and boys and girls in the population. Last point, I think the Committee on World Food Security is a very important part of the governance of food security and nutrition. It's an intergovernmental committee with multi-stakeholder participation, the only one, actually, and however, there's no magic. To what extent what the CFS negotiates and agrees upon is implemented is something that it's not up to the CFS, but of the members of the member countries that compose the CFS and the other stakeholders. Thank you, Raju.
Kostas, thank you very much. Colleagues, I will not dare to summarize this incredibly rich panel. I would just like to echo and in fact amplify something that Homi said, and that is for all of us, let us make more noise. Let us find ways to make more noise at this time. Thank you.